Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are going to be talking about Modern Elves. Now, this deck is going to be running you around $57, and if you stick around to the end of the video, I will talk about how we can make this deck into a Coco Elves deck. Let's get started, starting with our mana base. For this deck, we are going to be running only 16 forests. I know that may sound extremely low, but let's jump over to creatures and I'll explain why. We are running a total of 16 cards that are going to be producing mana for us. The first 12 are all 1-drop mana dorks. These cards are 4 Elvish Mystic, 4 Lenoir Elves, and 4 Arbor Elf. As you can guess, these creatures are going to be providing us with some mana ramp. Also, we'll be using them to swing in for damage later on in the game, because this deck is packed full of lords, such as Elvish Archdruid, which is not only a lord, but is also our last mana ramp creature. We're running 4 of this card in our deck because the absolute insane amount of mana it produces is going to be vital to our endgame strategy. One of the things that defines an elf deck these days is the fact that it has an ability to combo to draw a whole bunch of extra cards or get a bunch of extra creatures into play. I'll talk about the cards we're going to be using to do that in a second, but it's worth noting that this card, plus our mana dorks, is what's going to enable us to do that. Next we have 4 copies of Dwayne's Elite. This is a 2/2 for 2 with the ability of, when it comes into play, if we have another elf, we get a 1/1 elf token. We want to make sure we get that second elf every single time, because 1, it's going to give us more mana with our Elvish Archdruid, and 2, it's going to give us another body which is going to get bigger with all of our lords. Moving on, we have 4 copies of Elvish Visionary. This is a relatively self-explanatory card. As we play it, we get to draw another card, which, with all the mana we have, will probably allow us to play that card. Cantrips are always nice, especially in a deck where we're going to be emptying our hand by turn 5 on a regular basis. Now we have 2 copies of Lys Alina Huntmaster. This card is going to allow us to get more elves whenever we play an elf spell, which, as you can guess, almost every single card in this deck is an elf, 40 of them to be exact. The one downside is generally by the time we're playing this card, we already have most of our hand on the table. So in honesty, if you're going to be upgrading this deck, this is the first card you should probably consider cutting. Let's talk about the lords in this deck. The first one we have is Impervious Perfect. We are running 4 copies of this, and it is not only going to give all of our elves +1/+1, which is what a lord does, but it is also going to be used to generate more elves for us. Now I want to point out this is the weakest lord we have in the deck, so if you're looking at upgrading, this is a good card to consider cutting. Our next lord is Jorga Warcaller. We're running 4 copies of him, and he is one of our main win conditions. As you may have noticed, we have a ton of mana sitting around, so we need a place to spend all that mana. And this becomes a perfect opportunity. He has multi-kicker, which means we can spend as much mana as we can produce to not only make him huge, but also make every single other elf we have on the table massive. A lot of times, the turn after we play him, if he doesn't get immediately removed, we'll swing in for lethal and win. And our last lord is Azuri Renegade Leader. He is our primary win condition. We only have 2 of them in the deck because he is expensive and because he's a legendary creature, which means we do not want to draw into a second one of him, especially with some of our combo cards. Now he has 2 abilities we're interested in. The first one, he can regenerate any of our elves, which is nice, but it is not the reason we're playing him. The second ability is why we're playing this card, because it is an insane win condition for us. As we've already established, we have a ton of mana kicking around from our mana dorks and our Archdruid, so we can spend that mana to activate this ability, giving our creatures +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. And if you have extra mana kicking around after you play this ability, you can play it again, because, as I said, it is our primary win condition. The last creature we have is Sylvan Messenger. We're running 4 of this, and it is allowing us to cantrip into more cards, hopefully. When we play this card, we reveal the top 4 cards of our library and put any elves into our hand. Seeing how literally 2/3 of our deck is elves, that should be able to get us at least a couple cards. Now I want to point out there's better effects that do exactly what this card's doing, and we're going to see those in the upgrade section because they cost a little bit more money and I didn't want to put them in the budget deck. Moving on to spells, we have a total of 4 Lead the Stampedes in this deck. This is doing the same thing as Sylvan Messenger, except for it's revealing 5 cards, and it only costs us 3 mana to do that, allowing us to get a bunch of creatures into our hand and hopefully accelerate our board state. I want to point out that board wipe effects, such as Wrath of God, absolutely destroy our deck, so this card allows us to rebuild, hopefully quite quickly, if that ever does happen to us. If you're playing against a deck that doesn't have those cards, then play this as fast as you can, because you want to get as many creatures onto the table. That's the main deck. Now let's take a look at the sideboard. Firing them off as fast as I can. 3 Essence Warden, 3 Prey Upon, 4 Reclamation Sage, 2 Tomod's Crypt, 3 Wrap in Vigor. And that's it. That's the entire budget Modern Elves deck. If you liked this video and want to see more videos just like it, you may want to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. But before I end the video, I want to talk about upgrades and how we can make this deck into a Coco Elves deck. Now you've heard me say Cocoa Elves like 6 times now. I am not referring to making your elf deck a chocolatey delicious treat. It actually refers to Collected Company. Now this is a better version of both Sylvan Messenger and Lead the Stampede. It allows us to look at the top 6 cards of our library, we don't have to reveal them, choose 2 creatures out of those 6 cards with converted mana cost 3 or less, and put them directly onto the battlefield. Now this is made all the better with the ability to do it at instant speed, meaning we can, and probably should, do it in response to something our opponent's doing, whether it's attacking us or just playing a spell in general. This card is extremely powerful, and you should definitely play it if you have the money. Our next upgrade is Court of Calling, which as you can guess, kinda works similar to Collected Company. It allows us to tutor any single creature in our deck. So if our opponent plays a Wrath of God effect, we can tutor up a Zuri Renegade Leader and regenerate a bunch of our elves. Or if we want, we can tutor up any of our other lords. There's lots of good options with this, including our next one, Shaman of the Pact, which is not actually an expensive card, but in order to put black mana into the deck, it becomes a little bit more expensive, and I didn't want to do that with our budget version. As you can see with both Court of Calling and Collected Company, they could potentially grab Shaman of the Pact, which makes target opponent lose life equal to the number of elves you control. That's right, this in itself could be a win condition. And the last 2 cards actually replace some of our mana dorks. We have Heritage Druid and Nettle Sentinel. The synergy between these 2 cards works like this. Whenever you play a green spell, Nettle Sentinel untaps. Then you can use Heritage Druid to retap it to then get 3 mana. Here's an example. Turn 1, you play a Forest and Nettle Sentinel. Turn 2, you play Heritage Druid, a Forest, and any other 1-drop elf. You then tap Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel, and your other 1-drop elf to get 3 mana. You now have 3 creatures on the battlefield and 3 mana in your mana pool. And now it sounds like a really good time to start casting that Elvish Archdruid, which would then untap your Nettle Sentinel, and then you can swing in with the 3/3 on turn 2 if you feel like it. There you have it, that is Modern Budget Elves, and how to upgrade it so it becomes a Cocoa Elves deck, which is extremely competitive right now if you haven't noticed. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Giant Monster Games for more videos just like this, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster. Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a $68 budget Izzet Delver deck. For those that don't know, Izzet is a blue-red deck. There are some specific archetypes around Izzet as a whole, but in this case we're actually going to be going for a little bit of a different build than you might expect. Before we jump in, don't forget to vote for the next budget deck. There's a little thing up in the top right-hand corner up there where you can vote, and it'll help me drive what you guys want to see. Let's jump in, starting with creatures, specifically Delver of Secrets. We are running 4 copies of this guy. This card is actually what the deck is named after because it is such a
Randa versus Jaina. Strength.
You're here because you want to know everything there is to know about the Maximus 9 Hero motherboard from Asus. Well, good news, I can give you the 10-minute version. Let's figure it out. This is the Maximus Hero 9 from Asus. This is an ROG motherboard that is Republic of Gamers. It is the middle of the road Republic of Gamers. Well, it's sort of, I don't want to say entry level, because it's really not entry level when you look at it and you look at the features, but it is sort of the everyman gamer motherboard for socket 1151. Socket 1151 is for 6th and 7th generation Core i5, Core Intel, i5, i3, i7, Pentium Celeron CPUs. That's socket 1151. That's the one that has 16 PCI Express lanes directly into the CPU and 4 PCI Express lanes through the DMI, or DMI has about 4 PCI Express lanes worth of bandwidth. This is the Z270 chipset, which means that it has 24 PCI Express lanes through the DMI interface to the CPU available for peripheral connectivity. That's things like onboard USB, onboard M.2, onboard, whatever other peripherals there are, SATA. Well, not exactly, sort of kind of SATA. But yeah, Intel 6th and 7th generation CPU. This particular motherboard is outfitted as you would expect. It's got 4 DIMM slots. It has 3 PCI Express by 16 slots, 2 of which are armored and reinforced, made for big heavy GPUs that might be putting a lot of physical stress on the PCI Express by 16 connectors, and then a by 4 connector at the bottom through the DMI. Now, depending on what other peripherals you're using, the bottom slot may run it by 4 or by 2. By default, it runs it by 2. So if you're going to use a PCI Express NVMe like the Intel 750 and the PCI Express version, you're going to want to use that. Absent from this motherboard is SATA Express and U.2, although you can get an M.2 to U.2 adapter if that's your fancy. This motherboard does have 2 M.2 slots, both of which support PCI Express connectivity, one of which supports SATA connectivity, and one of the M.2 supports cards up to 110 millimeters in length, the other up to 80 millimeters in length, and it also has mounting points for 3D printed gear, but we'll get more into that in a moment. It has the fancy new USB 3.1 front panel connector. This is so that you can run 10 gigabit USB 3.1 at the front panel. So in terms of peripheral layout for PCI Express, as far as that goes, the 2 gray slots will run it by 16 by 0 for like a GPU, or if you're gonna run dual GPU or a GPU and a 10 gig Ethernet card, something like that, it would run it by 8 by 8. Those slots are directly into the CPU, and everything else is through the DMI. There are also 3 PCI Express by 1 slots, which you would use for a video capture card, maybe an add-in Ethernet adapter, something like that. It does have one built-in Intel NIC, an i219V. You could add a second NIC if you wanted through the PCI Express by 1. The M.2 is located above the 1st by 16 slot below the CPU, so I think it's going to have ample airflow. The second one is located near the bottom of the board, just above the bottom physical by 16 slot. So the placement of the M.2 motherboards, A+, it's really good. They should have good breathability. The audio solution on this is a Supreme FX based around the Realtek ALC 1220, and the Supreme FX codec is located at the corner of the motherboard as far away from everything as possible on an isolated part of the PCB. Even the left and right channels are isolated from one another so as to minimize noise and minimize interference. Let's take a look at the connectors on the motherboard so that you get an idea of functionality. Starting from the top of the board, going in a clockwise direction, you get your 8-pin CPU power. You've got 3 4-pin fan headers. This is for your CPU, optional, water pump, whatever. You get your first of 2 RGB headers. You get your Q code readout. Then you've got your mem OK button so that you can, if you're overclocking and doing stuff and you just want to reset the memory timings or, check the memory or whatever, you use that mem OK button. There are also 4 LEDs here located at the top corner of the board that give you diagnostic information as to the CPU, the DRAM, the graphics card, and the boot device. And so if there is a problem with one of those devices, you can see it here on the LED indicator just to make it so that you don't even have to look up the Q code in the manual, but you totally can look up the numeric code on the motherboard in the manual and see what the error is. And you've got a 3D printer mount hole, so if you're going to 3D print some accessories, you want to 3D print some bling for your motherboard, you can screw it into your motherboard there, then your ATX power connector, then your USB 3.1 front panel connector, and another fan header, then your 6 SATA connections, 2 more 4-pin fan headers, another 3D mounting point so that you can screw in something that you 3D printed to accessorize your motherboard. Then we've got another 4-pin fan header, this time for a water pump, but there's also water pump temperature and water flow inputs. Now, if you're going to be doing overclocking, 5 gigahertz and beyond, an all-in-one water cooler is what I would recommend. If you're going to run a custom loop, you can totally use the water flow and water temperature sensor inputs on this motherboard to have the Asus software and the Asus motherboard actually monitor your custom loop cooling solution. And you're going to need a custom loop if you're going to do extreme overclocking, because good lord, Heavy Lift puts out the heat. So keep that in mind, it's nice. At the bottom edge of the board, there is a 5-pin connector that is for an external fan controller. So just like the past 2 or 3 generations of Asus boards, if you need more fan headers and you want to be able to control it through the Asus software, you can get a board that plugs into the motherboard and it'll give you 3 more fan headers and 3 more temperature inputs. Then you've got your front panel connector, another Aura RGB header, another 4-pin fan connector, a temperature sensor, and then you've got your ROG header or USB 2.0 header, so that if you have an internal peripheral like your power supply has USB monitoring or your water pump has USB monitoring, you can plug it into the internal USB 2.0 header. But it's also good for the ROG front panel that we've seen on the last several generations of Asus ROG motherboards. So if you want to, the fancy ROG front panel, you can totally use that with the connected header on the motherboard. Then you've got your standard USB 3.0 front panel header. Then you've got TPM input for if you're going to use the TPM module for security, trusted computing, and all that. And then you've got a bunch of buttons along the bottom of the board. Now the big start button will of course start the computer. There's also a reset button. There is a safe BIOS mode where if you've been doing overclocking and the system won't post or whatever, you can hit that, and hopefully you will get a safe startup with conservative settings for your memory, your CPU, that kind of thing, so that you can maybe get a good boot. And then you've also got a physical retry button, which, if you were doing overclocking and maybe sometimes the system stumbles a little bit when it first boots and it's like, hey, something went wrong, you just hit the retry button and it'll retry all the settings again without resetting anything. Then you've got your Thunderbolt header, and then you've got your front panel audio connector, which is, of course, on the isolated part of the print circuit. Also at the bottom is a slow mode and mode for liquid nitrogen. So if you wanted to run liquid nitrogen cooling, or you want to go for the world overclock record on Kaby Lake and use liquid nitrogen, you can do that with this board. It has the appropriate modes for liquid nitrogen control. Slow mode is useful if you are booting the machine for the first time under liquid nitrogen, or you've got an extreme overclock or something like that. It will boot the machine without the without the extreme overclock insanity, I guess. Now let's talk about the fan headers. I don't know if you were counting. Did I count 7 fan headers? 8? 9? Well, there are 9 fan headers. But because there are so many fan headers, some of them are shared in terms of control. Now, 2 of the fan headers are 3 amps of output, so that's suitable for running, a big custom loop water cooling pump, or a fan splitter where you've got one fan header that's going to 2 or 3 fans in your system. You can't monitor the tachometer with that, obviously, but you could run multiple fans off of the 3 amp header, big water pump, whatever. 2 of the headers support 3 amp connections or 3 amps of power. All of the other fan headers support up to 1 amp, which should be plenty. The 2 that are linked are CPU fan and CPU optional, so those are linked in terms of control and in terms of how they behave, but that works out really well if you've got a push-pull configuration, or if you've got a radiator, like a 240mm radiator with 2 fans. You can use CPU and op for that to have the motherboard actually control that instead of the water pump, if that's your thing. That's usually how I do it when I'm running like a 240mm closed-loop cooler, so it is a useful, handy feature. Then the water pump plus and H amp are linked as well. So if those headers are meant for closed loop water cooling or custom loop water cooling, and both of those are linked for DC or PWM control. So just keep that in mind. Now, real quick, at the back panel, we've got our clear CMOS button, a BIOS flashback button. You can upgrade the BIOS without having the CPU installed. Your M.2 Wi-Fi slot, there is an HDMI 1.4 connection, DisplayPort 1.2. There are 4 USB 2.0 ports and 4 USB 3.0 ports, 1 anti-surge LAN, which is the Intel i219V I was mentioning before, 1 optical SPDIF out, and then 5 gold-plated audio jacks. Now the headphone connection for the onboard audio can do headphone impedance detection, so you don't have to set any jumpers or anything like that, and it supports a wide range. In fact, there are 4 presets for different headphone impedance settings for whatever type of headphones that you might be running. Now in terms of DDR4 and the overclock ability there, it does support DDR4 up to 4000. The fastest kit that I have is a DDR4 3200. Right now I'm running Crucial Ballistics DDR4 in this particular board that I did my overclocking and testing with. I've got an i7 7700K that'll hit 5 gigahertz no problem, and on this motherboard, as expected, it hit 5 gigahertz no problem. Let's take a look at the UEFI. Hey, look at that, we're running the Hero 9. We've installed our i7 7700K, new CPU installed, which is exactly what you want to see when you first turn on a machine. This is great, it works. Let's run setup. Now we're in the UEFI. Curiously, it did not take us to the easy mode screen, which I guess is maybe normal for the Hero motherboard. Maybe it's just because I haven't cleared CMOS, I'm not sure. Now the first thing that you always want to do is update the UEFI. When you get one of these boards, you always want to update the UEFI. And in fact, I know that there's a newer version of the UEFI available, 0701, newer than the 0604 that I've got on here. So before I do my testing, I'm going to update that. But this is a quick tour of the UEFI, so this is literally first boot of the motherboard. Now I could update the UEFI without even installing the CPU, but it's a video for another day. Alright, so my favorites is an area of the UEFI where you can tag features that you commonly change or features that you want at your fingertips, and it will show up on the My Favorites screen. So if like the DRAM frequency is buried or the CPU core limit is buried and you want to run that, then you can just set it on My Favorites and you don't have to find what screen it's buried on. You can just come back to it. Let's take a look at the main section. The main section just shows you your BIOS version, what CPU you've got installed, how much memory, clock speed, system language. There's also security information for setting a password, that sort of thing. Then we've got Extreme Tweaker, which is, target CPU mode frequency, 4.5 gigahertz. This is 4.2 on 7700K. Its built-in turbo boost will turbo as high as 4.5. I know the CPU will reach 5 gigahertz, no problem though. Target DRAM frequency, 2.4 gigahertz. This is DDR4 3200, so with the extreme memory profile, we can get up to 3200, no problem. Target cache frequency, 4.2 gigahertz, and target CPU graphics frequency, 1.1 gigahertz. Now, most of you guys, I figure, probably are not going to be running the iGPU, which will help you a little bit in terms of overclockability running an external GPU, because that's one more thing that does not have to work right at extreme speeds if you're not going to use the built-in GPU. These options give you control over the main overclocking features, but you do have things like Tweaker's Paradise where you can really get in there and mess with the base clock, the phase lock loop voltage, anything that the EMI voltage, anything that you might want to mess with to get you a little bit more speed or a little bit more stability. You can also mess with the CPU cache ratios, that sort of thing. Here's our CPU configuration where we can turn on hyperthreading, thermal monitor, Intel virtualization technology, VTD pass-through, those kinds of things. Here's the platform management configuration where you can turn on power management for both the EMI and PCI Express peripherals. The system agent configuration, I'm going to go ahead and turn on VTD because I like that. And I'm going to go back and turn on hardware virtualization because I use that. That way I can run virtual machines and maybe do hardware pass-through. Maybe do an updated Linux hardware pass-through video. Thunderbolt support is disabled. There's no onboard Thunderbolt. The ROG effects, the onboard LED and the Q-code LED post code, we can set it to auto. Onboard LED can be enabled or disabled. Onboard devices. You can set the PCI Express bandwidth, whether it's X2 or X4 for the bottom by 16 slot physical. So if you're going to install a PCI Express NVMe in there, you'll probably want to set that to X4. Otherwise, if you're using an M.2 NVMe, you would just use one of the M.2 slots. You can also configure M.2 number 1 to be SATA or PCI mode or auto, where it'll automatically just kind of do what it needs to do. Then we've got the controls for the as media controllers, so we can enable disable for the front and back USB 3.1 10 gigabit. This is sort of a Gen 2 USB 3.1. It's USB 3.1 protocol at 10 gigabit. That's an important distinction. The whole USB 3, USB 3.0, USB 3.1 Gen 1 is confusing. You should check out the KB Lake overview video because all of that is explained there. USB Type-C power switch, auto, RGB lighting. And this is nice because you can turn off the RGB lighting when the system is in hibernate or sleep. In case you've got a side window and you're like in a bedroom or something and you don't like the RGB lighting when the computer's off because it's making the room lit up so that you can't go to sleep, you turn it off. This disables the optional Bluetooth and Wi-Fi controller. This disables the Intel LAN controller or boot from LAN. It's disabled by default if you don't plan to boot from a LAN, which most of you probably don't. Then you can just leave that disabled. APM, hard drive smart information, USB configuration. You can configure, your USB situation, which ports are enabled, disabled. The monitor lets you see what your CPU, water pump voltage, fan speed, fan voltage, temperature, the whole 9 yards. You got QFan configuration. It'll auto tune if you run QFan tuning. You got chassis fan configuration where you can configure the RPM target and where it wants to step up, where it wants to step down, and the time that it takes to step up and step down. You ever be sitting near a computer and it's just constantly going, it's changing between two speeds really quickly, just instantaneously. This will let you set a slow ramp up or a slow ramp down, so like over 5 seconds it would ramp the fan up to a faster speed, or 5 seconds would ramp the fan down to a lower speed. So I generally recommend setting it so that it ramps down at a low speed, but it ramps up rather quickly, like 0 seconds or 1 second to ramp up, so that you get a better thermal response in case your computer's suddenly generating a ton of heat. It'll respond really quickly to that, but then it won't slow down for like 5 or 10 seconds or whatever, so that you don't notice it as much. And then boot lets you configure your boot options, compatibility mode, CSM, if you're going to run UEFI or if you're going to run legacy like BIOS mode, that sort of thing. And then under tool, you can use flash to flash upgrade the BIOS, do the setup animator, ROG, OC panel. This is the Hero, so it supports the ROG front panel connector thing, which you can find at the bottom of the motherboard. You can see the SPD information on your installed memory, and also graphics card information if you have a graphics card installed. So I'm going to save and reset. We're going to boot into Linux and see if that works. Hey, look at that. We booted into Fedora. That's a good sign. Didn't lock up or do anything weird. Wired Ethernet worked.
Are you my master?
This particular device does not have built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, so I don't see Wi-Fi or Bluetooth there as expected. Let's see if I can hear audio. Yep, I can hear audio. LS USB-T. It's the layout of our USB configuration. LS PCI, this is our PCI devices. And this is our I/O memory layout. And the network works perfectly. So happy to report, everything works on Linux. The graphics, of course, is the Intel iGPU, so the iGPU is working. If I were to go into all of the features in the software bundle, well, that could be its own video, honestly, because there's a ton of stuff in the software bundle. Let's take a quick look. Okay, let's take a look at a block diagram and the software bundle for the Hero 9. This is the block diagram for the Hero. This gives you an idea of how the peripherals are arranged with respect to connectivity through the PCH, through the DMI, and the PCI Express peripherals and how those are connected, memory layout, that sort of thing. Now the Hero features an ROG water cooling zone, which is a water pump header as well as a flow indicator. So there's a water flow indicator input. If you're running a custom loop and you've got, a water flow indicator, you can run that into the motherboard, and the ASUS platform will monitor the flow through your custom loop cooler. It also has water in and out temperature sensors, so you can deploy 2 temperature sensors to monitor the temperature of your water in your closed loop system. The software bundle here also includes Sonic Studio 3. Sonic Studio 3 lets you control audio routing so that different applications go to different audio output devices, because maybe you want your game in your headset, maybe you want a movie to go to external speakers, maybe you want other sounds to go to different output devices. I mean, when you think about your HDMI audio source, headphones, analog audio out, maybe you have a monitor that has built-in speakers. There's a lot of sound devices on any modern computer, and this gives you control so that you can have some applications go to some outputs and other applications go to other audio outputs, so that you've got flexibility with how you want audio routed through your computer. You've also got per application volume control that's a little more sophisticated than the built-in Windows audio control. Sonic Radar 3 is a part of the suite. Sonic Radar, what it does is it gives you a visual indicator of where sound is coming from, or more specifically, where a game has asked the sound hardware to render a sound like as if it is coming from that area. So if you're playing a game and something is happening in the northeast quadrant, well, the sound radar will let you visually see that. And if that feels a little bit too much like cheating, there's also the Sonic Radar 3 Audio Boost. The Audio Boost feature, it works similarly, but instead of giving you a visual indicator, it just boosts the audio. So if you're detecting a sound, say from this quadrant here, it'll just boost the sound so that you can hear it better, so that you're able to use your own ears to determine directionality. That might be a little bit more difficult if the sound were quiet. Aura, of course, is the name of the bundled RGB control software, which gives you the 2 independent onboard LED areas, plus you've got the RGB output. The RGB output on the motherboard is a different separate zone, and you can sync the lighting and sync the RGB control to a bunch of different sources of data from within the machine. The Aura software will let you control, what color you want, but also what it responds to. So you can flash, you can respond to temperature, strobe, color cycle, whatever you want to do as far as RGB lighting, if you're into that kind of thing. The Hero also supports the ASUS fan extension card. This plugs into a header on the motherboard, and then you provide external power to this control. This board gives you 3 more fan headers and 3 more temperature sensors that will be wired into the monitoring system on your motherboard. So so that you can use the onboard motherboard features to control fan speed, monitor temperature, and you don't need any extra software or anything extra. It's just built into the platform. So if there's not enough fan connectors on this motherboard or not enough temperature inputs, you can add this expansion board and have more fans and temperature inputs, but that still run through the motherboard so that you don't have to have any other software. Game First is also bundled with this motherboard. Now it is an Intel i2-19V, but this is packet prioritization software, which will let you use multiple network connections that your computer may have. So if you've got a Wi-Fi card installed and the wired Ethernet or multiple wired Ethernet cards, it will help you route and prioritize your traffic so that the game traffic is prioritized ahead of, say, a torrent that you might be running in the background, or file sharing services that you might be running on your computer, something like that. Also included is RAM cache, which will boost system performance by using RAM. Now this really is good if you're running 32 gigabytes of RAM. That'll help even if you're running 16, because not really a lot of stuff uses beyond 8 gigabytes of RAM unless you're a mega tasker. But 32, 64 gigabytes of RAM, whatever you might be running, this will have the system keep more stuff in memory to improve performance. And so they did a little test here where they're copying files back and forth, and they're able to lower the time it takes to copy a files from about 5.5 minutes to about 3 minutes, just by using a lot of the system memory for caching. You can also use RAM disk to actually have a program run entirely from RAM. It's a little different from caching, but it will actually use memory as a physical drive. Motherboard also has Keybot 2, so that when the machine is off, you can just hit keys on the keyboard to get to various system functions. So like CLR will clear CMOS, you can press enter on the keyboard to power the computer on. If you press delete with the computer off, it'll boot right into the UEFI. F12 will control XMP, F11 will do a one-click overclock so that the system will attempt to do overclock. Now I like the Dual Intelligent Processors 5 auto-tuning from within the ASUS software from within Windows versus F11. I think the software is a little bit more sophisticated because it'll do burn-in testing and that sort of thing. But you can do F11 and enable all of the presets for one-click overclocking. Keybot will also let you set up macros, even complicated macros with delays, so that you can hit keys to do complicated functions from within a game. I have not really had a lot of time with these motherboards and the platform yet. This is really just an overview. This is not extensive testing. I have not really had these for a long time yet. In about 3 weeks or 4 weeks, as we've had a chance to put these through exhaustive, extensive testing, we'll probably have a better verdict. But so far, 5 gigahertz on 75% of CPUs looks like it's a legit thing, at least for the 7700Ks. So that's exciting, because even though it's a 4-core part, 5 gigahertz is nothing to sneeze at. So that's been a quick overview of the Hero 9 from ASUS. If you get one of these, let us know. If you're thinking about getting one of these, come to our forum, because this thread is going to be long-lived. This thread is going to be as long-lived as this motherboard is, which is probably at least 18 months. So if you're not watching this in January, you could probably come to our forum. There's a link to the forum below, and find a lot of really good, relevant discussion on this motherboard, people who have bought this motherboard, the features that it has, some of the confusing terminology around, was it USB 3.0 or USB 3.1 or USB 3.1 Gen 1 or USB 3.1 Gen 2? If you're not sure about the i7 7700K or the i5 7600 or the particulars, there's a video about that and the general features of the processor and the general features of the Z270 chipset across a wide range of motherboards. There's a link in the description. So you should totally check that out. If you want to learn more about the platform, build a computer, and put something together, we will help you at level 1. Join us in the forums. I'm Wendell, and I'll see you there. I want my KB Lake, KB Lake, KB Lake. Intel's KB Lake chips. Barbecue sauce. I don't think anybody will even get that. It's the jingle from a Chili's baby back ribs commercial, and I'm out of ideas. I don't know what to tell you. So Intel, it's CES. It's the beginning of CES. It's the inauguration of CES. I'm not there. Don't know that I want to be there. But Intel's released new chips. It's updates, refresh. It's really Skylake Do-Over Edition. Intel 6th generation is what Skylake was. So you see Intel 6th generation, Core i3, i5, i7, whatever. This is like generation 6.1. Although in all of the Intel documentation, it says 7th generation. So the Skylake chips of yesteryear, there may have been a video of me. Yeah. So during the Intel release, you may remember the Intel Box Master System. So it's a little bit less ceremonious this time. So what's the release? You know, we go from Skylake with this, the Intel Master System, to KB Lake. What changed? It's like, well, there's some racing stripes on the side of the box, but also, I don't know if you can see it on camera, this guy's mustache is waxed. Yeah, the waxed mustache really makes a huge difference in terms of speed. Oh, they're gonna murder me. No one's paying me to make this. I'm just on here, you know, saying random things. In fact, somebody's like, get him off, cut the feet. So the big change with the KB Lake release is, of course, the Z270 chipset. Now, the Z270 chipset is what's in all of these motherboards. We've done a review on literally every single one of them. We've got ASRock, we've got Gigabyte Aorus, we've got Asus and MSI. All of these boards will reach 5 gigahertz with the i7-7700K CPU that I have. The launch day CPUs, I'm not exactly 100% sure what all of the launch day CPUs are. Certainly there's going to be the i7-7700K and the i5-7600K. There's also going to be an i3-7350K, although I'm not sure if that's launching on launch day or a little bit after. This is the first i3 part from Intel that is unlocked. And early reports suggest, you know, 4.8 gigahertz on the overclock, you can get that on a dual core part. I don't know, it's kind of weird though, because is it too little too late? Because a lot of games will take advantage of more than 2 cores now. It is 2 cores, 4 threads, so it's got hyper threading. But, you know, would you be better off with the i5 4-core or the i7 in terms of, you know, cost to performance ratio? What's the price point going to be? I'm hoping for around $150, $160 price point for the i3 7350K, but I have a feeling that Intel's going to push it a little bit higher than that. And so if you've got an older CPU, it's like, you know, if you're on Skylake, does it make sense to upgrade in a word? No, it really doesn't. Unless you've like got a really specialty workload. Like I know that some people have discovered that programs that are very poorly multi-threaded, like Adobe Premiere, which you would expect to be really well multi-threaded, would perform well on an 8-core CPU, a 6 or 8-core CPU, versus a 4-core, but that's not true. You know, the 4 gigahertz Skylake CPU will run circles around, you know, 6, 8 cores CPUs, and it's just because the software is poorly optimized. And so we saw a lot of other YouTube channels and content creators go for Skylake-based editing rigs with really fast disks, and so I think some of those folks are going to upgrade. It's like, oh yeah, you mean I can have 5 gigahertz overclock, you know, 4-core 5 gigahertz for my video editing rig? Heck yeah, sign me up for that. So I think we'll see some of that. If you're on an older platform, if you're on like an i5, i7, 2500, 2600, 2700, 2700K, if you get 2700K with an overclock, you could maybe think about upgrading. You could also wait for the next generation. You could wait for X299, you could wait for Zen from AMD. It really remains to be seen. The USB situation is also complicated. We've got a separate video on USB because you'll see some motherboards referred to as USB 3.0. Some motherboards will refer to their USB from the Intel chipset as USB 3.1. Sometimes you'll see USB 3.1 Gen 1. Sometimes you'll see USB 3.1 Gen 2. That explanation is, you know, 5 or 6 minutes in and of itself. So that's in a separate video. That's the next video in the series. And then there's a full review, including UEFI, including Linux testing on every single one of these boards. Get the one Strix Micro ATX motherboard, but otherwise these are all ATX. And the peripherals that you get with each motherboard is pretty varied this time. Some of the motherboards have SATA Express, some don't. All of them have multiple M.2 slots, even the Micro ATX, which has an M.2 on the back of the motherboard. Z270 adds more PCI Express connectivity through the DMI. Most people don't realize this, but the block diagram for the CPU is that it's got 16 lanes of PCI Express connectivity directly into the CPU, and there's an additional 4 PCI Express lanes through the DMI. Now, strictly speaking, those are not exactly PCI Express lanes. It's sort of a kind of modified PCI Express lane, and that goes to the DMI interface. And the DMI interface is for all of the other peripherals in the system. That's the chipset, Z170, Z270, whatever. Z270 ups that from 20 lanes on the DMI to 24 lanes. And that's PCI Express Gen 3 connectivity, so you can have more peripherals. But it does not increase the overall interconnect speed from the DMI to the CPU. So the DMI to the CPU is still limited to to 4 PCI Express 3.0 lanes worth of bandwidth. Even though there's more peripheral connectivity there for different motherboard vendors to take advantage of, the actual interconnect speed for the CPU not really any faster. So, does it make sense to run redrive, RAID M.2? Not really, when you can get M.2 drives that are pushing 2-3 gigabytes per second. The absolute top end limit on that DMI interface is a little over 4 gigabytes per second in terms of read and write speed. And so when you're talking about a single M.2 drive being able to saturate 50-75% of that bandwidth, then RAID 0 with those M.2s, does it make sense? Maybe if you get slower M.2s, maybe if you're doing right, maybe if you're doing some kind of exotic workload, not really sure. The MSI board also has an interesting PCI Express arrangement in that you've got an option of running by 8 for your graphics card and then by 4 by 4 is 2 PCI Express lanes. So this, if you've got like a by 4 PCI Express capture card or multiple by 4 PCI Express capture cards, you can do that, and those 3 slots are wired directly into the CPU. Some other higher end motherboards from each of these other vendors have similar functionality. And then of course we see pretty much universally across the board a PCI Express slot that is wired through the DMI that's PCI Express by 4. So if you're going to run a single PCI Express by 4 peripheral, you can totally do that. And the M.2 slots are of course PCI Express by 4, or they can be. Sometimes there are M.2 slots that share their PCI Express connectivity with other peripherals. So you might have to toggle an option in the UEFI to say that this M.2 slot has 4 PCI Express lanes worth of bandwidth, disabling a PCI Express by 1 slot on the motherboard or disabling something else on the motherboard in order to get the full bandwidth on the M.2. Otherwise the M.2 would run a PCI Express by 2. So in the official paperwork from Intel, it says, oh, there's a 12 to 19% performance improvement for, integers. And that's not untrue, but it's not the whole story. The 12 to 19% performance improvement comes from the fact that the CPU will turbo from, a sleep state like 800 megahertz to its full clock speed much quicker than in Skylake. Not much quicker, but significantly quicker. And because the clocks are higher. The numbers from Intel are always saying, well, let's take a look at an i5 and an i5. Let's take a look at an i7 and an i7. Let's take a look at an i3 and an i3. And it doesn't take into account anything at all. Like if you had Skylake and you locked your CPU speed or you did an overclock or anything like that, your integer performance gains are not going to be 12 to 19%. Clock for clock, Kaby Lake and Skylake are really the same performance. The changes to Kaby Lake is an improvement in the 14 nanometer FinFET process that Intel calls FinFET Plus, and that lets you break the 4.5 gigahertz ceiling that we saw on Skylake. So 5 gigahertz is pretty much the norm for Kaby Lake overclocking. I've got data from Gigabyte, from MSI, and from Asus that for their internal testing, we're talking 1,000 retail CPUs plus. 75-80% of those retail CPUs, not engineering samples, and the CPUs that I have are all retail CPUs, not engineering samples. Thanks to shady vendors on eBay. Because the Kaby Lake launch this time was leakier than a screen door on a submarine. It's just, I don't know, thanks Intel or boo Intel, I don't really know. So there's not really a lot that's been under a non-disclosure agreement. I don't know, the launch this time around has just been messy. But in terms of like performance gains, it's really not there. If you're on Skylake and if you're not one of those edge cases, I don't know that there's a reason for you to upgrade. If you're running like a Skylake i3, getting the unlocked part, maybe. The Kaby Lake parts will work on Z170, but you'll need to update your UEFI. So if you buy an old motherboard, an old Z170, and like the i3 Kaby Lake, which I think is something that a lot of people will do because the Z170 motherboards will be on sale, make sure that you can update the Z170 motherboard either through USB without a CPU installed, that the motherboard supports that. Otherwise, you may have to call the motherboard manufacturer up and arrange an RMA or arrange a BIOS chip so that you can upgrade that. Because if you put an unsupported Kaby Lake CPU and a motherboard that will support it with a software update, but you don't have the software update on the motherboard to start, you're in an impossible situation unless you can update the UEFI on the motherboard to support that somehow, either by installing a CPU, an older CPU, and updating it, or if the motherboard itself has a mechanism to update through USB without actually having a CPU installed. Some motherboards have that function, some don't, especially on Z170. More motherboards on Z270 have that function now than I've ever seen before, So that's good, but there's still 1 or 2 Z170 motherboards that don't support updating through USB, so keep that in mind. So you might be thinking, well, what about cooling? What's the cooling situation? Okay, we can get to 5 gigahertz, but how is that gonna work in terms of CPU cooling? Well, you're gonna need a good closed loop all-in-one cooler. You're gonna need a really good cooler overall. You're gonna need a top shelf air cooler if you insist on air cooling, but I would strongly recommend some type of water pump for cooling. I mean, if you want to go custom loop, that's fine, but you're going to need a high quality closed loop water cooler. You know, a 240 millimeter radiator, most cases support it. There's really no reason not to. All of the problems have been worked out. Some closed loop coolers will even warranty the cooler to the extent that if the cooler destroys stuff inside your machine, they'll help you replace the stuff inside the machine that the closed loop cooler destroyed. So really, if you're gonna overclock, if you're shooting for that 5 gigahertz thing, 5 gigahertz is no longer a unicorn. It's more, you know, I don't know, it's a workhorse, draft horse. 5 gigahertz is your, you know, standard issue draft horse, I guess now, that's attainable, but you know, it does require some care and feeding. Get a good closed loop water cooler, and you can thank me later. That's pretty much it for Kaby Lake. In terms of like changes on the silicon with Kaby Lake, there's really not a lot. Kaby Lake and Skylake, in terms of instructions per clock, are identical. If you have a Kaby Lake CPU running at 4 gigahertz and you have a Skylake CPU running at 4 gigahertz, they are going to perform identically. The Kaby Lake CPUs are clocked higher out of the box, and they're more overclockable in general than Skylake. Those are where the gains are. In terms of tweaks to the silicon, there are tweaks around the iGPU, which is maybe useful if you're going to use, you know, Linux for the iGPU pass-through. But most everybody's going to run an add-in graphics card. You're not going to do something exotic like, you know, GPU pass-through with, you know, Linux, like the video that I did last year with Skylake. I want to do an updated video for Kaby Lake, but that's a story for another time. So in terms of that, that's pretty much it. There is also a dedicated video hardware area of Kaby Lake, and it's because Kaby Lake was originally launched last fall, because there are laptops that had Kaby Lake forever, so people have already enjoyed this. The dedicated video processing area has codecs in it in hardware for 4K decoding. What does that mean? Well, it means that instead of using the general purpose computation area of the CPU to do your 4K decoding, it's actually done in silicon. So that translates to dramatically less heat production, dramatically less energy usage. And that's actually what you need right now. It's in production. If you have Netflix and you want to do 4K streaming with Netflix, you need a Kaby Lake CPU, because Netflix wants to use the hardware decoder, because if you're running Skylake or something like that, it's going to generate a ton of heat, especially in like a laptop. That's undesirable behavior. Netflix and others would rather use the H.264, the older standard, which uses a lot more bandwidth if you're going to use 4K. So Netflix is not going to do that, because a lot of people don't have that much bandwidth when we're talking about the older style encoding. So if you want Netflix in 4K, you need a Kaby Lake CPU, or at least you have so far, in terms of like having that hardware decoder. But other than that, not really a lot of changes. Most of the changes, you've probably heard me say it before, are improvements in peripheral connectivity. It's not really around instructions per clock. It hasn't really been improvements in instructions per clock for the last several generations. Let's dive in and go through all these motherboards. You know, I tried to make a 10-minute video on each of these motherboards, and I'm a talker.